The war was over. At least, that's what everyone kept saying. The surrender papers were signed. The guns had stopped firing. American soldiers were already planning what they'd do when they got home. But in a small room in occupied Germany, something strange was about to happen. Something that would never appear in any history book. General George S. Patton stood alone, waiting. He wasn't the type to wait for anyone, but today was different. A captured German general had asked to see him. Not for an interrogation. Not to negotiate. Just to talk. Privately. The request itself was unusual. Defeated generals usually wanted favors or protection. This one wanted neither. The note had been simple: I wish to speak with General Patton alone. This is not for the record. Patton's staff didn't like it. Sir, we don't know what this man wants, Colonel Harrington said carefully. He commanded forces that killed Americans. Patton looked at him calmly. I know exactly what he commanded. That's why I'm seeing him. This could be dangerous. The war is over, Patton replied. Traps are for men who still think they're fighting. A young intelligence officer spoke up. Sir, at least let us document this conversation. Patton's expression hardened. No. This meeting doesn't get documented. That's when everyone in the room understood. If this meeting happened, it would exist only in memory. No records. No witnesses. No proof. The door opened. The German general who entered was tall and thin. His uniform was clean and pressed, despite weeks of retreat and defeat. The medals on his chest were real, earned in actual combat, not given for politics. His name was General Friedrich Keller. He'd fought on the Eastern Front and the Western Front. He wasn't a Nazi Party member. He was just a soldier, a career officer who'd served his country and lost. Keller stopped 3 steps inside the room and stood at attention. Not because anyone ordered him to, but because that's how soldiers greet other soldiers, even enemies. Patton returned the gesture. A slight nod. Respectful, but not friendly. The door closed behind Keller with a soft click. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Keller did something unexpected. He removed his cap. Captured officers didn't do that unless they were surrendering something personal, something beyond military protocol. He set the cap on the table between them and looked Patton directly in the eye. General Patton, Keller said in careful English. I asked to see you to say something that will not appear in any report. Patton folded his arms. Then say it. Keller took a breath. Thank you. The word hung in the air like smoke. It didn't belong there. It made no sense. Patton didn't respond immediately. He studied Keller's face, looking for deception, for manipulation, for any hidden motive. He found none. Thank you for what? Patton asked. Keller's jaw tightened. For ending the war professionally. That's when Patton realized this wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a confession of respect. Keller continued, his voice steady. You advanced quickly. You broke our lines before we could collapse into chaos. You kept your soldiers moving forward instead of letting them settle into revenge. Patton's eyes narrowed. You're thanking me for defeating you? Yes. Patton let out a slow breath. That's a strange thing to thank a man for. Keller's gaze dropped briefly. Not for soldiers who understand what happens when armies collapse slowly. Silence stretched between them. Patton moved to the table and leaned against it. You know people won't understand this, Patton said. If anyone hears about this conversation. That's why I asked to speak alone, Keller replied. Patton studied him carefully now. Not as an enemy, but as a man who'd seen too much war. Why now? Patton asked. Why not earlier? Keller's eyes hardened. Because earlier it would have sounded like surrender. Now it sounds like truth. Outside the room, American officers waited nervously, unaware that inside, something rare was happening. Not reconciliation. Recognition. Patton didn't sit. He never did when he wanted to maintain control. Keller noticed this. German generals were trained to read posture like infantrymen read terrain. "You said I ended the war professionally," Patton said. "Explain that." Keller nodded slowly. Many American units entered Germany angry. Understandably. They had lost friends. Years of their lives. Patton didn't interrupt. Angry armies linger, Keller continued. They punish. They settle scores. That creates resistance even after surrender. Patton's jaw tightened slightly. "You didn't allow that," Keller said. "You moved fast. You didn't stop to humiliate us. You treated our collapse as a military problem, not a moral spectacle." "My job was to win the war," Patton said. Keller looked up. "No. Your job was to end it. There's a difference." That distinction hung in the air like a challenge. "You know many would disagree with your gratitude," Patton said. Keller allowed a faint smile. "Yes. Especially the men who needed the war to feel righteous until the very last minute." Patton looked at him sharply. "Careful." "I am being careful," Keller replied. "That's why we're alone." Then Keller did something that made Patton tense. He reached into his coat and slowly removed a folded piece of paper. Every instinct in Patton sharpened. Keller noticed and stopped. "It's not what you think." He unfolded the paper and placed it on the table. It was a map. Not large or detailed. A rough operational sketch, hand-drawn. Patton leaned closer. "This," Keller said, pointing to a marked line, "is where we expected you to slow down." Patton studied it. "And you didn't," Keller continued. "You pushed through anyway. That decision prevented a prolonged urban collapse. Fewer civilians died because of it." Patton's eyes flicked up. "You're saying you plan to let your own cities burn?" Keller didn't flinch. "That is what collapsing armies do when given time." Patton straightened slowly. "You're thanking me for not giving you time." "Yes." Patton turned away for a moment, staring at the wall. He didn't like hearing confirmation of what he'd already suspected. "You realize what this sounds like?" Patton said. Keller nodded. "Like an enemy praising you." "Like collaboration," Patton corrected. Keller's voice dropped. "No. Like professional respect." Patton turned back sharply. "You killed Americans." Keller's eyes hardened. "And you killed Germans. That was war." Neither man raised his voice. "They didn't need to." "That is not what I'm thanking you for," Keller continued. "I'm thanking you for understanding when the killing needed to stop." That was the line. The one that mattered. Patton stared at Keller for a long moment. "You don't thank a man for doing his duty." Keller shook his head. "You thank him when he does it without hatred." Patton laughed once, short and sharp. "You don't know me well enough to say that." Keller's gaze didn't waver. "I know you well enough to say you are not sentimental." Patton smiled faintly. "That's true." Keller took a breath. "Many of your peers speak of peace, of justice, of rebuilding." Patton crossed his arms. "And you don't trust them?" "No," Keller said quietly. "Because they speak like men who believe wars end cleanly." Patton's smile vanished. "What do you believe?" Keller hesitated just for a second. "I believe the next war has already begun. And it will be fought by men who pretend they didn't see it coming." Patton's eyes locked onto him. "And you think I see it?" Keller nodded. "Yes." That's when Patton understood. This wasn't just about gratitude. This was a warning. Patton walked to the narrow window and looked out at the courtyard below. American soldiers were loading crates, checking equipment, joking with each other. They looked relieved. Finished. Patton knew better. You didn't come here just to thank me, Patton said, his back still turned. No, Keller admitted. I came because thanking you was the only way to say the rest without being dismissed. Patton turned slowly. Say it. Keller straightened, stepping back into command for one final moment. Your army is strong and disciplined. But it believes this war ended because Germany collapsed. Patton's expression didn't change. That belief is dangerous, Keller continued. Germany didn't collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it was exhausted and surrounded. That's how wars end, Patton said. Keller shook his head. No. That is how battles end. The war you think you finished was fought over territory. The next one will be fought over corridors. Patton's eyes sharpened. Corridors. Rail lines. Rivers. Mountain passes. Industrial choke points, Keller said. We studied them obsessively. The Soviets study them more. Patton crossed the room in 2 steps and leaned over the map. Show me. Keller pointed precisely. Here. Here. And here. Patton followed each point, his mind already racing. These are the same routes, Patton said quietly. Yes, Keller replied. Because geography doesn't change its loyalties. Patton straightened. You're telling me the Soviets will move west? Keller met his gaze. I'm telling you they already are. Silence. Outside, a truck backfired. The sound echoed briefly like distant artillery. Patton exhaled slowly. You understand what you're doing? Yes, Keller said. That is why I asked for you. Why not tell Eisenhower? Keller's lips tightened. Because Eisenhower is building peace. And you don't trust that? I trust armies, Keller said. Not optimism. Patton let out a low chuckle. You sound like me. Keller allowed himself a thin smile. That is why this conversation will never be repeated. Patton grew serious again. You know, if this comes out, they'll say I listened to a German general over my own allies. Keller nodded. Yes. They'll call it disloyalty. Yes. They'll bury me. Yes, Keller said again. But they will still read your reports. Patton stared at him. You're counting on that. Keller didn't look away. Professionals plan for how truth survives institutions. Patton picked up the map and studied it again. You realize thanking me makes this worse for you. Keller shrugged slightly. I am already defeated. My reputation will not survive the peace anyway. Then why risk it? Keller's voice dropped. Because the men who win wars rarely get thanked. They get blamed later. Patton laughed quietly. You think I'll be blamed? Keller looked at him steadily. I think you will be blamed for being correct at the wrong time. That hit harder than any insult. Patton folded the map and handed it back. I can't act on this. Not openly. I know, Keller replied. I can't cite you. I know. I can't even admit we spoke. Keller nodded. I know. Patton studied him for a long moment. But you wanted me to hear it. Yes. Patton stepped back. Then I've heard it. Keller exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time. Then my duty is complete. Patton's expression hardened slightly. One more thing. Yes. If you're right, Patton said, this won't be the last time I hear this warning. Keller shook his head slowly. No. It will be the last time you hear it without consequences. When Keller left the room, he didn't salute. He simply nodded once, soldier to soldier, and walked out without looking back. Patton remained where he was. He didn't call his staff immediately. He didn't write a report. He stood alone with the silence. Eventually, Colonel Harrington knocked and entered. "Sir." Patton turned. "He's finished," Harrington said. "What did he want?" Patton's eyes hardened. "To say goodbye." Harrington searched his face. "That's all. That's all you need to know." Harrington didn't push. He couldn't. Patton's tone made it clear, this wasn't about secrecy. It was about survival. Later that evening, Patton sat at his desk with a blank report form in front of him. The typewriter waited. He didn't touch it. Anything he wrote would turn the meeting into evidence. Evidence could be dismissed, twisted, or weaponized. Silence, however, had weight. He opened his private notebook and wrote only this. "Enemy generals are easier to understand than Allied committees." He underlined it once. The next day, Keller was transferred to a holding facility in the South. No special treatment. No punishment. Just procedure. Patton never asked about him again. Not because he didn't care, but because asking would create a connection. Connections led to investigations. Investigations destroyed useful truths. Weeks passed. Patton's reports began to shift subtly. He didn't mention Germans. He didn't cite Keller. He emphasized geography, logistics, rail corridors. He warned against static occupation, against overconfidence, against assuming the Soviets shared America's vision of peace. His language was careful. Too careful. Eisenhower noticed. "Soften this," Eisenhower said during one briefing, tapping a page. "It reads suspicious." Patton met his eyes. "It reads accurate." Eisenhower frowned. "You're starting to sound like you don't trust the peace." Patton replied evenly. "I don't trust pauses that pretend to be endings." Eisenhower sighed. "George, be careful." Patton nodded. "I am." But the warnings didn't land. Not because they were wrong. Because they were inconvenient. Months later, Patton would be criticized for his tone, his bluntness, his inability to adjust to peacetime. People said he was difficult. What they didn't know was that Patton had already chosen silence once. Not out of fear. Out of calculation. Because he understood something few generals ever did. The most dangerous truths are the ones you can't afford to prove yet. By late summer, whispers began. Patton was too suspicious. Too focused on the Soviets. The phrase, politically difficult, appeared in conversations where his name was mentioned. Eisenhower noticed but said little. The war had been won. Patience had replaced urgency. Patton was being quietly isolated. Invitations stopped. His remarks were filtered before they reached higher desks. He wasn't punished. He was managed. That's how Patton knew the danger was real. Institutions only manage people they fear will embarrass them later. Somewhere in southern Germany, Friedrich Keller disappeared into obscurity. No trial. No headlines. Just a name that dissolved into the mass of defeated officers. He never spoke publicly again. Patton never asked about him. In autumn 1945, Patton submitted a report warning that prolonged occupation without clarity would create future confrontation, not stability. The report came back with red markings, tone unnecessarily confrontational. Revise. Patton read it once. Then set it aside. Weeks later, he was reassigned. Officially, it was about health and fatigue. Unofficially, it was about control. When Patton died in December 1945, the obituaries were respectful but incomplete. They praised his victories. They described him as a brilliant general, unsuited to peace. No one mentioned that he'd understood the next conflict before most people had finished celebrating the end of the last one. Years passed. Borders hardened quietly. Influence zones expanded politely. Rail lines that once carried German divisions now carried Soviet supplies. Then came doctrines. Then came standoffs. Then came a new war, one without declarations but full of the same maps Keller had pointed to. In military academies on both sides, instructors began emphasizing the same corridors, the same vulnerabilities, the same inevitabilities. No one credited a German general. No one credited Patton. The terrain made the argument on its own. Late in life, a retired American officer was asked what separated Patton from other generals. The man thought for a moment. Patton understood when the killing had to stop, he said. And when the pretending had to stop, too. That was as close as history ever came to acknowledging the meeting. Patton never received public thanks from an enemy. He never asked for it. Because he understood something deeper than gratitude, that the most meaningful respect between professionals is not praise, but the willingness to tell another man the truth when it no longer benefits you. The German general had done that. And Patton had listened. That was all either of them needed. The rest was inevitable. History didn't record the meeting. There was no file, no memo, no footnote. If someone went looking for the moment when a defeated German general thanked George S. Patton, they would find nothing. Just clean paper and silence. But the consequences of that conversation rippled outward anyway. In warnings ignored. In truths suppressed. In a Cold War that Patton saw coming before anyone else was willing to admit it. The German general who thanked Patton gave him something more valuable than gratitude. He gave him a burden. The burden of knowing the truth before the world was ready to hear it. And Patton carried that burden alone, in silence, until the very end.